Hi everyone, welcome to the session. So let's understand what is async await in JavaScript. So till now we have seen that using callbacks and promises we can handle asynchronous operations in JavaScript. But then with callbacks we had a situation of callback hell, and in order to avoid that we were using promises. But then in promises we end up having something like this method chaining, right? And this compromises the code readability. So this is a shorter program, but then let's say if you have a lot of asynchronous operations, that time it will become very complicated and it will become a bit difficult to read the code. All right, so for that we have something called async await. So let's see what it does and how do we implement asynchronous operations using async await. So async await, what it does is that these are two different keywords and we always implement async await together, right? So these two keywords are supposed to be used together. You cannot use async and not use await, and similarly you cannot use await without async. Okay, so these two go together. Now let's understand what these are. So async, it makes a function return a promise. It makes asynchronous code look and behave like synchronous, right? So what we were doing with callbacks and promises, we were calling the function with callbacks and promises the way we wanted them to get executed. We were deciding, right, okay, this function should get invoked first, after this which one should get invoked, right? So that is how we were handling them in callback hell and then in method chaining. But in async await, what you can do is you can call your function in a linear way, in a synchronous way, right? So when you write a synchronous code, you simply just call the function in the order you want them to get executed without worrying about, okay, which one is taking how much time, right? So in async await as well, you can just define your asynchronous operation functions, whatever you have, and then you can call them one by one, just like you call your functions in a synchronous code, right? In a linear way. And then await keyword, right? This makes an async function to wait for a promise. So await keyword is used inside the async function and it tells JavaScript to wait for the promise to resolve before moving on to the next line of code. So let's just do one thing. Let's do this with an example and then understand this. So I'll go back to the code where I have implemented promises, and then we'll convert that to async await. So if we go back to this code, right? So I have three functions, and if I show you, so I have function 1, function 2 and function 3, and these are three tasks that I wanted to be executed exactly in this manner, right? And if you see, I'm using promises in all these. I'm returning a promise object, right, in all the three functions. And you can also see that I have a specific time for the execution of these three functions. So these three are asynchronous operations, right? So here, if you see in the method chaining, we had to do something like this, right? But as I said, that in async await, you don't have to use the method chaining. You can call your function in the linear way. So that is what we are going to do. So in async await, we don't need this. Okay, so I'll remove this. Now, if I go back to this deck, here it says that we have to use these two keywords, okay, async and await. So here we will create a new function. Okay, so with this keyword, async keyword. Okay, so async and then all tasks done, something like that. We have to create a new function, and here inside this I'm going to call one by one all the functions in the linear way. The way I think it should get executed, I'm going to call it exactly the same way. Okay, so I'll declare a variable const, and then let's say order food. I'll just give it a name, and here I'm going to call function 1 because I want that function 1 should get executed first. Let's say if I had a situation where I would have wanted that, okay, function 2 should get executed first, so I would have just written it in that manner itself. But here I want function 1 to get executed first. All right, so here I will invoke function 1. So function 1, and before this invocation I'm going to use this keyword await. Okay, so this is giving error because we also have to use function keyword. All right, okay, so here await is making sure that before your execution goes to the next line, it will make sure that the promise gets resolved for function 1. Okay, and until and unless the function 1 promise is not resolved, it will pause the execution. Okay, so that is how it is making sure that everything is running sequentially. So here, and in function 1, I think I have a value in the resolve. So in resolve, I'm getting a value, right? So let's just print the output of function 1 here. So we will log the value and order food, right? So after this, I want function 2 to get executed. So I am going to write the next line, and here eat the food, and here again I am going to use await keyword, and then I will invoke function 2, and then after this I will, here also I'm getting a value, right? So I'm going to just log the value, and then similarly I will call the last one. I'll give it a name and then await, and then function 2 3, and then I'll receive the value and log it, and then finally we will just log a final statement, all done, right? So here if you see, it is much better than the method chaining, right? Than using the then and catch. So here if I now run this program, let's see what happens. So this will get we have to call this function function as well, right? Otherwise it won't get executed. So we'll call this function here, and now let's run this and let's save, and then it should start getting executed. So order the food, everything will get executed in sequence. Okay, eat the food, sleep, and all done, right? So this is how we write async await functions. Okay, you have to use async keyword, and then when you are sequencing, like when you are calling the function, you have to use await keyword, so that this will make sure that the promise for this function, whatever you are invoking, gets resolved before the execution goes to the next one. All right, that is how it is maintaining the linearity over here. All right, so now in all of these functions we are only getting the resolve, right? But let's say, what if I make any of these conditions as false, right? So in that case we will receive reject. So how are we going to handle that? So we can write this code in try catch block for that. Okay, so try, and then we'll move this code in try block, and then in catch we will just console the error. And then let me save this, and then but we have to make one of them as false, right? Then only we'll get that reject result. So let's say I'm just going to make this one as false. So in this case, in function 2 invocation, right, I'm not going to get resolve, but I should rather get reject. Okay, could not sleep, I should be getting this one, and then everything else, yeah, couldn't eat the food, right? But it's not printing the error message, so let's put an error message here, right? For that we can do two things, right? We can just console the error. So there's something called console.error, so we can use that. And if I run this now, let's see what happens. So see, now it is showing the error, right? Exactly, couldn't eat the food. So it stopped at the invocation of function 2, because in function 2, rather than resolve, it received reject, right? So it just halted over there. Now let's take one more example and see this. Okay, so I'll create a function to fetch data, and here I'm going to return new promise, and this has two parameters, resolve or reject. And here let's set a timeout. I'll write a function here for fetch data, and inside this will return new promise, and promise has to resolve and reject. So resolve and reject, and then inside this we are going to write an asynchronous operation, and here we'll use set timeout, and let's give it a delay of, let's say, 2000 milliseconds, and let's take a variable here. Okay, const success, and here I'll just make it as true for now, and if success, then return resolve. Okay, so resolve, and here we'll pass a message, we have the data. Then in else part we will return reject, so reject, failed to get the data. Okay, so we have this function now, and if I have another function, let's say I have another function which is function use data. Okay, if I have something like this, data received and then data, if I have something like this, and I want to make sure that function 1, this function should get executed first, and then only this should get executed, right? If I want to make sure of that, then how can I do it? Using async await, right? So the first thing that we saw in the previous example, we have to use this keyword, right? Async. All right, and then here what we can do is, let's just remove this first, and we will declare another variable, and also let's just write this in try catch already. Okay, and then here I'll just include catch. So here I'll first declare a variable, fetch data val or something like that, and here I have to use await keyword, right? Await, and then it has to wait for which promise to get resolved, for this function promise to get resolved, right? So this function, and then this, and then because this function will return a value, right, in resolve, so that is what we are going to log. So here fetch data val, and that's it. And we of course have to call this function to get executed. So use data. If I now invoke this function and run this, let's see what happens. Okay, so this should get executed first based on the resolve, because right now I have kept this as true, so it should be returning resolved, right? So let's see what happens. So we have the data, all right, but if let's say if I make it as false, then it should return us reject, fail to get the data, right? So this is how you can use async and await, right? So all you have to do is that when you are invoking your function, right, so in that particular function, first of all you have to make use of async keyword, and then you have to, while invoking the other function, whichever you want to chain, you have to use the await keyword. So this is going to just make sure that the promise for this function gets resolved before any next line or any other functions that you're calling here gets executed. Okay, so that's all I had in async and await, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.